So let's say the traveler wasn't the protagonist of Genshin. Perhaps the Abyss sibling was the only one that arrived in Teyvat, or perhaps the traveler and their sibling are antagonists. But either way, let's say the traveler is no longer the protagonist of Genshin. Who would we want to take over as the main character in Genshin Impact? Obviously, we need to establish some criteria to determine our new protagonist, because the story of our time in Teyvat would change dramatically depending on which character we're using to navigate the world. There are three main requirements I think a character would need to meet in order to be considered a good candidate for our new main character. Firstly, they must be a traveler. If the story of Genshin Impact is going to require us to go through all the nations in Teyvat, then it would make sense that our character would need a motivation to travel. The traveler's motivation is finding their sibling, among many other reasons. So, what characters do we have that could fit this description? A few come to mind immediately. Alice is a renowned travel guide writer in Teyvat, so she certainly fits the bill. Not to mention, she's also likely an outlander, which places her outside the influence of Teyvat. A good bonus. We also have characters like Kazuha, who could very easily and with very little adjusting be a character that travels the world, and not just between Inazuma and Liyue. Captain Beidou would be another great example of this because a pirate queen like her has every reason to travel around the world. Of course, we also have the Harbingers. All of them are required to travel, and some of them, like Child and Scaramouche, have interesting backgrounds and personal dynamics between different characters. That's not even mentioning some of the more minor characters, like Xiangling, who could very easily be tweaked into being a good traveler as well. So now that we have a good handful of characters that seem like they fit, let's move on to the next requirement. They must have a strong motivation and a desire to help. All great protagonists have strong motivations for the things that they do. The traveler wants to find their sibling, Child wants to irritate me at every given opportunity. You know, the good stuff. And while I wouldn't say that a protagonist necessarily has to start out with a strong moral compass, they have to at least be willing to help others while they're on their journey. In Genshin Impact, at least. Essentially, the characters must be able to feel a need or desire to help others, but not be so distracted that they forget about the purpose of their own journey. So, which of our above characters fit this bill? Child has a strong desire to get stronger and fight more and more powerful enemies. This is definitely a strong motivation to move forward, but I would argue Child's loyalty to the Tsaritsa, plus the fact he was willing to summon an ancient god to kill everyone in Liyue Harbor, disqualifies him pretty handily. Beidou travels around and hires out her services, but we've also seen her defend Liyue basically for free. This being said, it seems like her loyalty is mainly to Liyue, as one might expect. And while I do think she would help someone if she saw they were in need, her main motivation for traveling seems to be her own freedom, and I can't imagine Beidou would allow herself to get swept up in the troubles of other nations. Kazuha also falls into this category. He does help Inazuma, but his freedom is too important to him to give up readily, which means he's unlikely to move through the other nations and become invested in their stories. Alice could be considered a contender, though we don't know much about her motivations. Like Klee, she seems to be a good person with a little bit of chaos. But we also know that she's part of the Hexen Circle, which tells me that she's invested in the things that happen in Teyvat to some degree at least. I would argue that characters like Xiangling simply don't have enough motivation to be good protagonists. Wanting to find new ingredients to cook with is great, but I can't imagine Xiangling having the desire or capacity to get involved with other nations' problems. Scaramouche, however, especially after he transforms into the Wanderer, is another strong contender. It seems as if the Wanderer traveled extensively, searching more or less for a purpose, which is a pretty strong motivation if I do say so myself. And on top of that, he's shown to be polite and helpful when we meet him in the Sumeru Archon quest. So now that we've narrowed down the list a bit, let's move on to my last requirement for a good protagonist in the Genshin story, so we can see how it all comes together. They can't know more than the player about Teyvat, at least in the beginning. Some of you might be wondering why I didn't suggest any of the Archons, or Neuvillette, or Dainsleif as my protagonist, and this is why. They simply know too much about how Teyvat works for them to be compelling protagonists. In an RPG like Genshin, we want to be able to learn, along with our protagonists, how Teyvat works. It's also the easiest way to include things like tutorials. Alice is a being with a lot of knowledge and power in Teyvat, and that automatically disqualifies her, which leaves us with, well, Wanderer. But wait, I can hear everybody crying. Wanderer used to be Scaramouche, and he was created by an Archon. He should be disqualified too. He also went to the Abyss, and he was a Harbinger. How does he meet this requirement at all? Or if you're not saying that, maybe you're just typing glazing in the comments, which, fair, but let me explain. We all know what happens to Wanderer at the end of the Sumeru Archon quest. He yeets himself into Irminsul to try to correct the wrongs of the past, and as a result, creates this sort of half copy of himself in the world. This is Wanderer. With no real memories of his past and no clear purpose in his life, he wanders. It would not be a stretch to think he might end up in Mondstadt, nor would it be a stretch to think he might fish Paimon out of the lake. From there, Wanderer's story continues, helping the people of Mondstadt and growing closer with some of them. It's not the sense of purpose he was looking for, but it begins to develop into something else. He enjoys this sense of community, and though he does have to move on before he leaves, perhaps the Animo Archon might suggest he talk to Morax. Perhaps during the Rite of Dissension, he might gain information on his predicament. Of course, he arrives in Liyue, Morax dies, Child is an asshole, but once again, Wanderer helps the Adepti and the people of Liyue fend off Osile. Now again, you might be wondering, if Wanderer doesn't have a vision, how could he be of any use during the fights? Well, while Wanderer might not have his memories, that doesn't mean his body is weak. He was still crafted by an Archon, and he's able, just like the Raiden puppet, to resonate with the elements. It's not as clean as the Traveler, but it doesn't mean the Wanderer is a pushover either. As the Wanderer's journey continues, he meets more and more people, and more things seem familiar to him in a strange way, a way he can't quite put his finger on. It's only after he once more returns to Sumeru when he gains back his memories and remembers who he used to be. But from here, the Wanderer has lived two different lives, a life of pain and betrayal and anger, and a life filled with community and loyalty, a life that shows there are people and things worth fighting for in Teyvat. He knows, at least in part, what the Tsaritsa's plans are, and maybe from here he decides to absolve the sins of his past by continuing on his path and working to stop the Tsaritsa and the Abyss Order. A very nice story, no? There's only one more problem I can see. If Scaramouche has to become a god in order to then be defeated and yeet himself into Irminsul, how could the Sumeru Archon quest happen like it does in the game? Well, don't you worry, because I have an answer for that too. We know that Scaramouche was making contact with Irminsul as they were preparing his body to transform into a god. So it would be easy to think that if he were thinking about his past, he might come across what truly happened to Niwa and the others. And in a fit of manic rage, he decides the best way to right the past, and as a bonus, ruin Dotare's plans, is to just destroy himself in Irminsul. But how could they have gotten the Electro-Gnosis? Considering Yai is the one holding the Gnosis, I could see the Harbingers bartering for it. Dotare would be the one to arrange this, but I still think it's within the realm of possibility. While yes, this does require some changing of the story in Genshin, overall Wanderer's character wouldn't change that much. And truthfully, I still think this would be a really compelling story. So, who do you prefer, the Traveler or Wanderer? Let me know down below, and as always, may the wind bless your travels.